If you stick around to any hobby long enough, you start to hear a lot of conventional wisdom popping up. It can be super easy to believe this stuff, especially if a lot of people are saying the same thing. But today, I want to put some of those popular claims to the test with the help of science. Today, we're looking to test 3 of these popular ideas, starting with a classic. Using metallic paint on your wet palette causes the shiny pigments to get into your other paint. The idea seems reasonable. Wet palette paper is porous, which is actually the key feature that allows it to do what it does best. Water through osmosis travels through this membrane and gets into paint, making it last a lot longer. So why wouldn't paint pigment get through this membrane as well? To test this theory, we'll first paint a control swatch so we can compare before and after. Then, with that same paint still on my palette, I'll dump a bunch of metallic paint right below it, and we'll wait a couple of minutes. The metallic paint that I'm using for this test is some of the finest mica flakes that I know of in a product in our hobby, and we're also overdoing it. You would never have this much metallic paint on your wet palette sponge. So if this stuff is ever gonna get in this stuff, it's gonna happen in this test. After a few minutes of waiting and a little mix, we'll paint again with the same paint, and after it's dry, we can see that this claim is completely false. Myth busted. You know, it makes sense when you think about it. If there were any truth to this claim, it would also happen with every other kind of paint on your palette. Let's say you had a red and also a white. Is your white paint slowly getting more pink over time? No. All right, on to the next potential myth, and it might be a little bit more difficult to test. Paint consistency is a difficult thing to define, and that's a bummer because it's a major hurdle for a lot of beginner painters. They often ask questions like, how much should I thin my paint? Often people will try to describe the right level of dilution by comparing it to milk, or I've also heard people compare it to melted ice cream. Those both seem like reasonable ideas. Let's test both. This is what science looks like. Firstly, I'm going to thin some paint to what I believe is the ideal solution for base coating, and then I'm going to put it in a dropper bottle. For this test, we're only going to use Citadel paint. All right, with that determined and also our melted ice cream and milk in the exact same dropper bottles, we can get on to testing. By the way, if you are into these wasteland punk miniatures that I've been testing on, you'll see more of them in the third claim that we're testing in this video, but they're from the sponsor of today's video, Miniac Games, and their new board game, Paradise, which is a waste punk skirmish game set in a ruined post-apocalyptic world where rival factions of survivors clash for control over territory and resources. It's designed for both pro players and beginners with simple and intuitive mechanics with the intent to allow first-time players to jump into the action without needing to spend hours studying the rulebook. For board game fans who stayed away from war games, Paradise offers an entry point, fast-paced matches that combine light strategy and fun. Every faction and model is overflowing with characterful design. I've worked with Miniac Games in the past, and I've always enjoyed painting their figures. They've collaborated with some of the finest fantasy and sci-fi artists, and Paradise fully reflects the studio's creative spirit through its distinctive visuals and artistic direction. They're one of the only companies that I work with regularly where I'm willing to make a video showcasing a paint job of one of their figures because they make fantastic stuff, and this game is shaping up to deliver on a very similar level. One mechanic that I love from the game is how it deals with dying models. In a skirmish game, things get bad quickly when you begin to lose figures from your small warband of 5 or 6 characters. In Paradise, your models don't die, but become knocked out, and can only be revived by willingly giving your opponent victory points. A hefty cost, but an interesting way to approach this problem. The game is launching on GameFound on July 4th, but if you follow the campaign before it launches, you'll get a free copy of the exclusive miniature of Kyra Rust. I'll have all the links down below in the description if you want to pick up your own copy of Paradise. Thanks to Miniac Games for sponsoring this video. Now back to our tests. All right, with my testing material ready to go, we need to figure out a way to semi-accurately test this. Give me a second. This janky little setup right here that you just watched me assemble is the
Paint Dilution Tester 5000.
which you can tell because I wrote the name in black Sharpie on black poster board. Genius. I don't have a silver Sharpie. What do you want me to do? Basically, this is some poster board with a half pipe glued to it. The plan is to drop some liquid at the top here, measure how fast it moves with a high-speed camera at this particular given angle, which is about 63 degrees, and then compare those numbers to what I've defined as the optimal paint dilution. Let's give it a try. All right, I got my setup, I got my milk, I got my high-speed camera. Let's give it a shot. It just stays there. Okay, maybe we need more aggressive of an angle. I have some spacers here that I can remove, which will increase gravity. Hopefully. Maybe it needs 2 drops. Well, let's just do another drop to see if it will make a difference. I don't think we're gonna need a high-speed camera to measure this. Yep, that's going. Okay, new plan. We have a glossy piece of gray plastic art here. No track, nothing like that. We're just gonna drop liquid with a pipette, so we use the exact same amount of liquid each time, and I measured it to be enough to cause the kind of movement we want to get. So let's see if this works now. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, that did something. That kind of worked. So let's check the footage. There it is. Nice. This is like a crappy version of slow-mo, guys. All right, I'm gonna do that 3 times for each trial, just to hopefully average out any error that I'm getting in this totally jank setup, and we'll see what our results are. Something tells me we're not gonna need high-speed cameras to bust this myth. Number 1, my ideal painting dilution is so thick that it wasn't really getting into the pipette very easily, which is kind of my first sign that something's wrong here. Number 2, I wanted just to see what was gonna happen if I just squirted it out onto this board from the bottle itself. That is definitely more liquid than I did with my milk and my ice cream test, and it's going nowhere. We can also do the same test with a pro acrylic paint, which out of the bottle is just a great dilution to work with for base coats. I tested it on the model as well. Another range that's really great diluted out of the bottle, Reaper MSP.
Where you going? Nowhere.
What if I just go full 90? Okay, it's going nowhere, bro. It's definitely thicker. For some additional context, here is what a paint thinned for the airbrush looks like, and here is what undiluted Citadel paint looks like. Look, I don't know if this is an accurate measurement for dilution, but this does imply something about the thickness of the paint that at least I use while base coating. And all I can say is it's nowhere near as thin as milk is, or even melted ice cream. It's a little bit thicker than that. So, myth busted! On to our final claim to test, and it's a bit more artsy. Real quick, I don't want to interrupt too much of this video, but I just want to announce that myself and the talented sculptor Jordan Cuffey over at Skullforge have teamed up with Humble Bundle to bring you
Miniac presents an intergalactic Skullforge STL bundle,
which is basically a bunch of amazing sci-fi sculpts done by Jordan, all part of a huge bundle that you can buy for a really cheap price, or whatever price you kind of want to pay. And some of that money goes to Jordan, some of it goes to me, and also most importantly, some of it goes to charity. So you can support us and charity at the same time, and also get a lot of really cool sci-fi models that I'm personally excited to use for player characters and NPCs in my Star Wars RPG, but can be used in all kinds of different settings. They're really awesome models just to paint because they're so tastefully sculpted. They're not drowning in details. They're just lovely, simple models that emphasize the fun parts of minis to paint. Check it out, I'll link it down in the description below. Okay, back to the video. A lot of painters say you shouldn't use white to mix your highlights or black to mix your shadows. Instead, they say you should use something that is naturally dark for your shadows, say like a navy blue or a purple, or use something that's naturally light, like a light yellow, to mix your highlights. For this test, I'm gonna paint 2 models, one where I use exclusively white and black for my highlights and shadows, and another where I use everything else. To make sure I don't break any rules, I'm gonna break my white palette down into 3 different sections. On the left, I'll have my white and black in all the colors that I mixed with them. In the middle, I'll have my pure midtones that are identical across both models. And on the right, I'll have my non-black and non-white colors and all the variations I mix with those. We'll start with the flesh of both models, and for my colorful model, I'll mix a dark red into my shadow. Skin is a very common area for beginner painters to get hung up on, and I was no different. When I began using warmer colors for the shading of my Mini's skin and more colorful highlights, that's when I really began to level up the painting of my Caucasian skin tones. Immediately, you can begin to see a difference in the models. Mixing only black into our skin tone gets us a really muted and desaturated look, whereas using a dark red gets us something more lively and close to pink. For the highlight of my colorful skin tone, I'll use an off-white yellow, which helps to maintain some of the saturation of the skin. I've seen people also use off-white orange in this situation as well. Now, there's a bit of a caveat with this test. Colors like violet from Chimera, which uses pigment PV23 or dioxazine violet, are naturally incredibly dark and can be used as a shadow by itself. But on the other end of the spectrum, for the lights, a color like cold yellow, or PY151, or benzimidazolone, probably butchering that word, is not that bright. It is lighter, but I wouldn't use this exclusively as a highlight. I would use something like pastel yellow from AK 3rd Gen. And this might have this yellow in here, but it also has white in it, which is a color we're trying to separate with colors and whites and blacks. For this test, I'm going to do what most miniature painters do who would tell you to not use white and black, and that's use colors like pastel yellow or like violet from scale 75, which are a mixture of pigments, often including black and white, but also some color. Okay, let's move on to some fabric, and for that, I'm going to use the color ochre, a darker yellow color. One thing I want you to notice is how black tends to affect yellow colors. It's almost turning it into a green color, and if we're using a colder yellow, the effect would be even more severe. Unless this is something you're going for, this can often be an unwanted surprise with the color yellow specifically. To avoid this on my colorful test model, I'll instead mix my shadow with a dark, warm brown color. This produces a shadow color that, in my opinion, is more appropriate for ochre, a rich, warm yellow color. To get some variety on the highlights, I'll use off-white orange for the fabric instead of off-white yellow again. While I continue on with this experiment, I thought I'd talk a little bit about mixing paint. These two paints are both magenta, but they're not created equally. Quinacridone from Mindwork has a single pigment in it, which means that there's one pigment contributing to its overall color, whereas Screamer Pink from GW doesn't list what it's using and likely uses a bunch of different pigments, maybe 2, 3, or even 4. When I mix both of these paints with phthalocyanine, I get pretty different results. On the right, I get a much more richer, vibrant color, and that's because there's only 2 pigments interacting. Whereas on the left side, I get something that's a little bit darker, maybe a little bit muddier, less vibrant. And that's because there's a whole party of pigments trying to fight over who's the most important. And when that happens, they often meet somewhere in the middle, which can tend to be a little bit grayer, browner, and just muddier in general. This does not mean that you shouldn't mix GW paint or any other hobby brand for that matter, but it's good to know why hangups occur when they do. For the shirt and other fabrics, let's do something a little bit different. White is a color that often gets more interesting with a fun shadow color, so let's show that by shading it with a desaturated blue color versus the alternative, gray. White and black alike are neutral colors that often pop up on your models, and it's super easy to fill them in with a neutral gray as a shadow or a highlight respectively. But with a little bit of color, you can make them mesh with whatever your scheme is a lot more. You can effectively use any color you want with black and white, and in this video, we're using the very typical choice of blue. Now, normally when I'm painting a model, I don't go through this extent of shading and highlighting on every single part of the model. Like I wouldn't necessarily mix a shadow for every single detail, like the small things. I would treat them, maybe with a wash or something more simple. But for the sake of comparison, I am going to treat each part of this model like that, so we get the best one-to-one example of how using colors as opposed to white and black really do impact the feel of the entire model. Let's move on to the last major part of this model, and that's all of the leather components and the metal. To keep the neutral model accurate, I'll wash all the brown and metallic parts with a black wash. For the colorful option, I'll use the same brown we're applying to all the straps and bags to the metal as well, and build up from there to get a brownish metal color. In my opinion, that fits the setting these models come from really well, getting us a tarnished metal effect. Mixing simply white into a color like Rhinox hide creates this overly pink highlight that I've never been a fan of. So to avoid that, I'll mix in the ochre color from earlier that we used on their pants to push that highlight into a color that I like more. To get the opposite end of the spectrum, for the hair, we'll go black, so we can see what a black highlighted with something interesting looks like compared to its neutral adversary. That'll finish up this third and final test. So after this test, is this a myth busted? Should you only ever use colors for your shadows and highlights? Should you only ever use white and black for your shadows and highlights? Well, it's kind of up to you. We can only go so far making a science of what is essentially an art form. You get to pick what you think looks coolest. And most often with situations like this, the result is rarely ever so binary. The reality is that some things may look cool with a black shadow mixed in. For the skin tone, it looks unnatural, but that may work for certain kinds of minis with a nice ashy shadow as opposed to a rich and vibrant red one. To share my own personal opinion, allowing yourself to use other colors for your shadows and highlights opens up such massive doors for creating custom color schemes. So I would never give that up personally. That's going to be it for this edition of Mini Painting Myth Busting. As a reminder, if you liked the miniatures or the paint that you saw used in this video, make sure to check out the campaign, link down in the description below. Let me know if I had any of my takes completely wrong, if you thought I should have changed the way that I experimented with some of these claims. I'd love to know if there are more claims you want me to test in maybe a future edition of Mini Painting Myth Busting. If you like this channel and you want to support it, there are a number of ways to do that. A lot of things linked down in the description below, such as my Amazon affiliates, where I share tools that I use for my hobby that you can also pick up at no extra expense to you. I also have a Patreon where you can get access to my Discord server and hang out and chat about your miniature painting projects or the next myth to bust. You can also check out my product web store, Miniac.co, where I sell all kinds of things like hobby tools, like a cutting mat or a brush coffin to store your brushes, also merch for the channel, also miniatures like wood elves and vampires, and also large masterclass courses that are multiple hours long that teach you all the skills you need to paint a beautiful display model and also show you how to paint that display model. That's it for now, guys. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint more metal!